Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Brotherton here, and we are going to be talking about phylogeny. So what is phylogeny? Well, this word comes from the word phylogenesis, which means the origin of tribes or groups. All right, so this is the study about how different groups or tribes, you could call them, in biology kind of exist or come to be and what their relationships are to each other. If you remember from our Diversity of Life project, all things on Earth are related. We all share one common ancestor based on the four things we all have in common, which is having cells with phospholipids, having DNA, having ribosomes, and having cells filled with cytoplasm. So we all share those things in common. And then what phylogeny is about is, okay, well, if we all share this point in common, how do we get all this amazing, beautiful, and wondrous forms, as Darwin said? How do they all arise from that, and what are the relationships, and how do we make sense of all of that diversity? All right, so we go back to Linnaeus and taxonomy. So this is how we classify organisms and assign each organism to its group, and we give them these universally accepted names. Once again, that goes back to the binomial nomenclature. That was that two-word naming system from Carolus Linnaeus. It's always going to be italicized. The first word is always capitalized, and the second word is always going to be lowercase. So that's our genus species. Examples: Homo sapiens, or this example I have here is Ursus arctos and Ursus maritimus. And this is going to be the grizzly bear and the polar bear. Now, what's interesting here about the grizzly bear and the polar bear is our species definition that we talked about was species have to be reproductively isolated, and if they're not reproductively isolated, then they can't produce offspring that can then go on and have offspring of their own. What's interesting about the grizzly bear and the polar bear is they do tend to be reproductively isolated in the wild, but as the polar ice caps continue to shrink due to climate change, the polar bears don't have as much Arctic ice to hang out on. And if you look at their binomial name there, Ursus maritimus, maritimus means they are maritime animals. They like to spend their time out at sea, out on that ice. And as that ice is shrinking and they're retreating back onto land, they're no longer reproductively isolated from grizzly bears. And actually, they can produce viable offspring that can then go on to reproduce. So technically, polar bears and grizzly bears are the same species. And it's kind of weird to think about, but maybe actually polar bears aren't going to go extinct, and maybe they're going to just form hybrids with grizzly bears moving forward. All right. So taxonomy. Once again, all life is classified in those three domains based on those common characteristics. We studied these. The bacteria are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles, and they can get us sick. They can also make yogurt. Archaea, these are also prokaryotes, but they live in really extreme environments. And remember, they do share a little couple things in common with eukaryotes, and that's why they're more closely related. And eukaryotes are like you and me. Eukarya, so eu means true, karya means chromosome, so that means we actually have chromosomes. We have a nucleus. That's going to be our plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So just a little quick review still going. Each domain can then be broken down into more specific levels based on their shared characteristics, and that's when we get back into this stuff. Our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Or if we go back, how I told you guys to remember it, drunken for domain. So drunken, kangaroos, punch, children, on, family, game, shows. So that's how I remember it. Drunken, kangaroos, punch, children, on, family, game, shows. All right, so when we finally get down to the bottom there, we end up with that binomial nomenclature, that genus, species. Okay, so we get to Homo sapiens or Ursus arctos. All right. So what is phylogeny all about? Well, really what it's about is showing the evolutionary history and these relationships and how closely related animals are. All right. And we do that a couple different ways. So we can show how closely related things are based on their genetics, all right? So we can organize them based on shared traits, shared characteristics, physical characteristics. We can group them based on known taxonomy, but ultimately all of that comes from genetic evidence. And really it's constructed to make the most simple relationships possible. So if you have two organisms that have very similar genetic codes to one another, then you can make the assumption that they are going to be more closely related than things that have really dissimilar genetic codes. I think I said earlier how there are a couple genes that never really change, that are foundational for all life, and we can compare those sequences to one another to really tell how closely related all life on Earth is, because there's a couple genes that everything needs in order to run its system. You can think of genes as kind of the software for life, is how I think about it. All right, so really this evolutionary history here is showing us how closely related things are, and this one's really cool that I have up right now because it's showing you kind of the evolution of tetrapods. So tetra means four, podia or pod means foot, so things with 4 feet or 4 limbs like you and me. And so you can see our old buddy Tiktaalik here that I talked about earlier, and our old buddy the coelacanth, and some lungfish, kind of like mud skippers and stuff like that. So what's really cool about this is phylogeny is really showing you how closely related things are, but it can also show you how changes have occurred over time. All right, and we'll talk about what these mean, and what each one of these branches mean here in a second. All right, so phylogenetic trees, they're classifying organisms into their large taxonomic groups, the phylum, family, all of that stuff. And then as it goes, it's getting more and more and more specific. So things are getting into more specific physical characteristics that they show in common, and they're showing you the order that species diverged from a common ancestor. Okay, and some of them, like the last one I show you, can actually show you the time of divergence, which is what's happening here. They're showing you how many millions of years ago they diverged. How do I know that it's showing me this? It's kind of like that cladogram stuff we talked about before, except in a cladogram, this little branch right here tells you when they no longer share a common characteristic. This phylogenetic tree is showing you when they diverged from a common ancestor. All right, so what this is showing you is that turtles and all of these guys over here shared a common ancestor up until this point, and then they diverged, so turtles went their way, and everyone else in this group went that way. All right, this is kind of cool because it's showing you that birds are really closely related to all the non-avian dinosaurs. Well, what is a non-avian dinosaur? What does that mean? Well, that means non-bird-like, and you can kind of see some of those here. So these are kind of going to be your theropods that walked on 2 legs that are more similar to birds. And these are going to be stuff like your Stegosaurus and Triceratops, stuff like that are more distantly related to birds that currently are alive. All right, so let's get into how we read these things. So we can learn what groups are most closely related, all right, and we can learn which groups are least closely related, and we can learn which groups diverged first or the most long ago. So what's really cool about this is showing you right here that a fern, a pine, and a rose, okay, are all going to be have the same relationship to a moss as one another, because you can see here these guys diverge, they all go this way, and our moss goes this way. So you could say that let's see, a fern here is going to be less similar to a rose than a pine is, because our pine and our rose are both more closely related to each other because they're on the same branch here. Okay, they diverge from one another, sharing a common ancestor here. And we'll get into that right now. So speciation, each one of these branches on the tree is showing you a speciation event. That's when you're going to have new species arising from a common ancestor. That could be due to all kinds of things, genetic drift, gene flow possibly, just general natural selection, whatever's causing that speciation event, behavioral changes, etc. All right. You can also have things showing you extinctions on a phylogenetic tree. All right. So if we read this thing, we start from the trunk, which is the bottom here, and then we can go up to each one of these nodes. So these nodes right here, or like this one's already circled, this is showing you a common ancestor and then the divergence from that common ancestor to a human and a bird. All right. What this is showing you right here, this flat line right there, right up against an animal or right up against the name of an organism, is showing you an extinction event. Okay, so each node represents a common ancestor, and that's where a speciation event is going to take place right here. So at some point, humans and birds shared a ancestor in common, and we diverged and went our own way. And then you could say this whole entire group of insects that we're talking about here went extinct. Okay? All right. So how do we not read these things? So this is something that students commonly get mixed up because of that kind of like great chain of being thing we talked about, or the idea that somehow evolution is progressing towards something. So a lot of students will read these that a bacteria evolved into an amoeba, evolved into an insect, turned into a trout, which then turned into a human or a bird, and that's not correct. What this is showing you is that a bird and a human shared a common ancestor here and diverged from each other here. And a human and a bird and a trout shared a common ancestor here and diverged from each other here. And we can keep running that back until we get all the way back to the common ancestor of all of these organisms. So these lines are showing you that all of these things have continued to evolve on their own path. It doesn't mean that a bacteria turned into an amoeba, turned into an insect, turned into a trout, turned into a human or a bird. That's not how it works, okay? And they also do not show that A is greater than B is greater than C is greater than D. So this is not showing, because a human is over here, that somehow it's greater than a trout, which, you know, that's not what it's showing you, okay? It's just showing you how closely related these organisms are to one another, where they diverged from one another, and when they shared a common ancestor. So if we go back here, you can see that, okay? It's showing you where they diverged from one another, where they shared a common ancestor here. Okay, and let me go to our last slide here. So, what do you know from this phylogenetic tree? What can you tell from this? Well, you should be able to tell that all of these organisms shared a common ancestor here. You should be able to tell me which organisms diverged last from this group. Which organisms diverged last? How do I figure that out? Well, you just follow each one of these branches, okay? And the last branching is going to tell you who diverged last. Guess who diverged from the primate group last? It's going to be chimpanzees and humans. Which organisms are most closely related to prosimians? Well, you see who diverged first, and that's going to be our New World monkeys are going to be the most closely related to prosimians. Okay, you could say which group maybe is the least, let's see if we said of our old world monkeys or ape group, who is the least like the prosimians. So you can do all kinds of different stuff looking at these. You just have to know that each one of these straight lines means a common ancestor. Each one of these represents a point of divergence. Okay? And what all of this means is that all of these organisms are still currently alive. Okay? None is greater than the others. It's just about how closely related they are to one another. All right, guys, so that's it for today. Thanks a lot, and stay curious. Bye.